Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would share just an interesting conversation today and sort of get into this possible upcoming fight a little bit. And that is a possible fight between Regis Prograis and Adrien Broner, which I find to be a very interesting matchup. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about, is this that good of a matchup? Is it a bad matchup? Who I think would win this fight, at least off of an early prediction, and overall what I think is going to happen. So, anyways, if you recently tuned into the Ben Askren versus Jake Paul card, you know that one of the undercards was Regis Prograis versus Ivan Redkach, a fight that Regis Prograis firstly won by, I believe, unanimous decision, because at first a punch that was landed by Regis Prograis was ruled as a low blow. Then later on, it was figured out, it was figured out that it was not a low blow, and overall it ended up being changed to a knockout. So that's what ended up happening in his fight. From what I've seen, because I was not able to see the full fight, he did look pretty decent. Looked like his sharp counter punching ability was there. Looked like the decent athlete that he's pretty much always been. Looked like the skills pretty much were there. And of course you expect him to have a good showing against Ivan Redkach, because Ivan Redkach really in his career actually has been, well, at least to some people, at least quite disappointing. A lot of people forget, but Ivan Redkach years ago was actually looked at as one of the top prospects in all of boxing until he faced Dejan Slatichinin, and then it went all downhill from there. So it is what it is. But anyway, when it comes down to it, man, Regis Prograis looked pretty good. Adrien Broner also did not have a fight too long ago. But in Adrien Broner-like fashion, within his past several fights, he did not really look overtly impressive. Now, of course, a certain amount of people would say that's because he didn't fight for all the year 2020. He had a long layoff, yada, 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 yada. Regis Prograis actually said something about Adrien Broner, which I found interesting. He said that Adrien Broner does not appear to be the same fighter anymore, that he believes he is done. He believes that he is over. That's what he has said. Now, whether he 100% believes that or not, I'm not sure, because he kind of contradicts himself a little bit here and there. But when I take a look at this fight, if you were going to ask me how good of a fight I think this is, I mean, it's certainly a fight that I would tune into. I do think that it is a pretty decent fight. I think that Adrien Broner, no matter who he fights, he's always going to attract some sort of attention. In boxing, actually, there almost is no such thing as bad publicity, and some people may disagree, but even some of the fighters who are the most hated end up receiving the most amount of views or receiving overall the most amount of attention. Certain fighters like Floyd Mayweather Jr., Adrien Broner, and Jake Paul, who obviously, isn't really like an actual boxer, but has been in the sport of boxing now, bringing some attention to it. A lot of negative attention, but attention nevertheless. So it is what it is. But this fight clearly would get a lot of attention. I think a lot of people would be entertained by the idea of this fight. But do I think it's a good fight? Do I think it's a 50-50 fight? What do I personally think of this fight? Well, I think that, once again, I think it's a good fight to set up. And I certainly would be entertained by this. But I can't call this a 50-50 fight. And, I think that's, to a lot of people, that would be obvious to say. But when I just take a look at Adrien Broner, I count Regis Prograis as an A-class fighter, personally. Now, the interesting thing about Adrien Broner, whether you be a fan of him or not, and I think there's more people in the world of boxing that don't like him than like him, but once again, you usually are going to still tune into an Adrien Broner fight, at least, some of the times, because, he can be entertaining, either that or you want to see him possibly get his ass kicked. There's a certain amount of people that have that mentality with him. So he's always going to attract a certain amount of attention. But when I take a look at Adrien Broner versus Regis Prograis, obviously Regis Prograis has to be the favorite in this fight. I mean, when I take a look at it, Adrien Broner, I think that, when it comes to him, I think he's always been very athletically talented. And of course, the Adrien Broner fan base, they always say the same things. And this is what people always say about Adrien Broner. They're always just like, oh, well, if he would only focus more, if he would, just do this, listen to Floyd Mayweather and do this. Well, in my opinion, and a certain amount of people may not agree with this, I don't think Adrien Broner really ever had that much of a chance to be an A-class fighter. And a certain amount of people may disagree with that. But when I take a look at Adrien Broner, not only is his boxing IQ not there, because he has a very difficult time with those intelligent offensive styles. Really with A-class boxers in general, but especially with a fighter that, really pinpoints well with his jab, and overall is really offensive. He really just has no idea what to do, and he really gets smothered by a certain amount of people's offenses. Every time he's been beat, it's pretty much been the same. So it is what it is. Or been in a tough fight, it's pretty much been that way. So Broner, in my opinion, when you take a look at him, I've just really never been overtly impressed with his skill set. I think that he has a decent skill set, and I think that Adrien Broner very clearly is probably a B plus fighter. You can argue Adrien Broner is in that same range with, say, Victor Postal, if you wanted to. And a certain amount of people may even disagree with that, because Victor Postal had a very good win in his career over Lucas Matisse. But if I were to just take a look at that match personally, I'm not really sure who would win between Adrien Broner and Victor Postal. You guys would have to let me know on that one. But Adrien Broner, B-class fighter. And when I just take a look at his career, there's certain fights that look more interesting than others. The Sean Porter one, I never looked at as a 50-50 fight, because I thought Sean Porter was going to be pretty much the same size as Adrien Broner, and I thought that he was clearly the more skilled fighter than Adrien Broner from what I've seen, and I ended up being right on the money with that. The Mikey Garcia one was interesting, because Mikey Garcia was a bit smaller than Adrien Broner. Adrien Broner, with his weight, to be honest with you, probably is a natural welterweight when we take a look at his weights, at least a natural 140-pounder for sure, but probably is a natural welterweight. But when it comes down to, he just was not able to handle Mikey Garcia's offensive game. He was not able to handle it. He was not able to handle his counterpunching ability, his power. He was not able to handle the skills of a Mikey Garcia. In the Manny Pacquiao fight, a lot of us pretty much predicted how that was going to go. But this fight is also one of those fights, and I think Adrien Broner gives a certain amount of people of hope for this, at least his fan base, that he might pull out of one of these fights one day. And when I do take a look at Regis Prograis, I do think he is very talented. But I do think that there are certain faults in his game. I do think that sometimes he can be a little bit too hittable, sometimes a little bit too straightforward, sometimes he can keep his hands down a little bit too much. Sometimes relies a little bit too much on his speed to get certain punches in there, and sometimes is not as defensively responsible as he needs to be. But will that be enough for Adrien Broner to possibly win this fight? Here's the question. Will Adrien Broner finally sum something up in his career to where he will be able to win the first A-class fight of his career? Because what we know Adrien Broner can do, he can really, we know Adrien Broner can do one of two things. He can give a very tough challenge to the high-class, B-class fighters, and most likely win against those type of caliber fighters. And he can take a hellified ass whooping from the A-class fighters. That's pretty much what we know Adrien Broner can do. So what category is Regis Prograis in? Well, in my opinion, he's an A-class fighter. And when I take a look at the style of Regis Prograis, once again, I think this is a decent fight to set up, but I do not think that Adrien Broner would do very well in this fight. That's just my personal opinion. I think Regis Prograis, his counterpunching ability, his speed, his strength, his ability to fight on the inside, I think it will give Adrien Broner a lot of problems. I think that he would stun Adrien Broner. I think overall that Adrien Broner would be really overwhelmed in this fight. Now, once again, it's an intriguing fight, and I give Adrien Broner more of a chance in this fight than I do obviously against a Manny Pacquiao or than I did against a Sean Porter. And some people would disagree with that because Manny Pacquiao was a little bit older in his career. And at that time, a certain amount of people actually looked at the Adrien Broner versus Sean Porter fight as a 50-50 fight. I never personally did. But it is what it is. Now, the Mikey Garcia one, I favored Mikey, but it was 60-40. And the reason why it was 60-40 is because I was really interested to see how he was going to handle that weight of Adrien Broner. He handled it well. So when I just take a look at this, I think that, once again, I think Regis Prograis does have certain faults in his game. I think Regis Prograis can be a little bit too hittable. I think Regis Prograis overall sometimes needs to be a little bit more defensively responsible. And it is possible that Adrien Broner could hurt him or make this a tough fight in the second half of the fight, because there are certain fights where I've seen Regis Prograis slow down a little bit in the second half, especially if they go to the body, like a Josh Taylor did in their big fight that happened not too long ago. But when Adrien Broner gets overwhelmed, he really just becomes, he goes into this protective shell. And I don't usually like to use this word when it comes to boxers, but he usually runs around the ring. That's usually what he does. And I don't like to use that word with certain fighters. I don't even like to use it with a Get him Oregon Thou, Arisani Lara, or Floyd Mayweather Jr. Because usually it's not running to me. Usually it's just fighting on the back foot. But if you're on the back foot and continuously circling around the ring and not throwing anything, you would have to consider that running around the ring. And when Adrien Broner gets overwhelmed by a certain amount of offense, he does not let his hands go. Because to be honest with you, he can't. Adrien Broner does not have the A-grade counterpunching ability. He does not have the boxing IQ. He does not have the boxing skill set to really counter that type of attack like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. could, like a Terrence Crawford could, like someone overall who fights very well on the back foot possibly could. I think there's, a possibility that Adrien Broner could hurt Regis Prograis. I think there's a possibility that Adrien Broner could make this a tough fight, could be an 8-4 fight. But when I see this fight, I personally see it about 9-3, maybe even more in favor of Regis Prograis. And Regis Prograis said recently, and I can't remember if I mentioned it in this video because I've redone this video a couple of times, but Regis Prograis overall said recently that, well, Adrien Broner's a bit older now, and overall he don't look like the same fighter to me, and he didn't necessarily look great in his last fight against Santiago, but really if we want to go there, I haven't really been overtly impressed with Adrien Broner for his past several fights. Really the last time I was thoroughly impressed with Adrien Broner in a fight was his fight against Habib Alakverdiev, or whatever his name was. That fight was like all the way back in 2015. That fight happened 6 years ago. So when it comes down to it, it's been a very long time since I've been impressed with Adrien Broner. He ended up getting a stoppage victory over Ashley Theophane, but it was tough in certain moments. He had a tough fight with Jesse Vargas, which was scored a draw. Could really argue it either way. Could argue that Adrien Broner won that fight. But Jesse Vargas, he kind of ran out of steam in the second half of that fight, so that's kind of why he did not end up winning that fight, because I thought that he completely won the first half of the fight when he was sticking his jab out there and putting out a consistent offense, but he just couldn't keep that engine going the whole entire time. So it is what it is. Santiago, I didn't think that he looked very good against Santiago. There's even a couple of people who have argued that he lost that fight. When I watched that fight, I thought it was a lot closer than what the scorecard showed, certainly. But when it comes down to it, I would have to rewatch it fully. So I'm not sure on that. But either way, here's also another question. Has Adrien Broner gotten a little bit older? Now, of course, he's 31. What I mean by that, by has he gotten a little bit older, is he an old 31? And that's what Regis Prograis has. Has he gotten older in terms of, has he gotten more damaged? Is his body, really more damaged is what I'm trying to say. How much damage has Adrien Broner received? Because his past several fights, really, to be honest with you, I don't think that he's looked overtly impressive in any one of them. Obviously, we've seen the Mikey Garcia and Manny Pacquiao fights. The Adrian Granados fight, happened in between that time. I'm trying to think of another fight. The Ashley Theophane fight, and recently the Santiago fight. I don't think that he's looked overtly great in any of those fights. So we'll see what happens. But personally, if I think this fight were to happen, I think it's a good fight. I would tune into the fight. Would I pay pay-per-view if it were a headliner? No. But we'll have to see what happens with that. But when it comes down to it, it still is an interesting fight. I would like to see it. Apparently, this fight could possibly happen on Triller, from what I'm hearing, which is the new company that I've heard of that hosted the Ben Askren versus Jake Paul fight. So that could be very interesting. But we'll see. We'll see what happens with this fight. If I had to guess, this fight most likely is going to happen at 140 pounds. And once again, if I had to guess who's going to win this fight, I would have to bet on Regis Prograis. I just think that Regis Prograis is a better fighter. I think he's a greater fighter. I think that his type of style, even though he does have holes in his game that I've always somewhat seen, I think that he just has too much offense and too much power and too much speed and counterpunching ability for an Adrien Broner. And that's just personally what I see. But we'll see what happens. I'm hoping this fight happens. And, even though I've never really overtly liked Adrien Broner as a character, once again, I don't love or hate any of these fighters. It would be nice to see Adrien Broner possibly pull out of a fight to where we can say, wow, this is the greatest win of his career. Adrien Broner is going to be remembered as, the 2010s version of Zab Judah. Zab Judah was a fighter that fought, his peak was pretty much, obviously he started in the 90s, but his peak pretty much was in the 2000s. When it came down to it, Zab Judah was also known as a fighter that was very athletically gifted, but just lost basically every big fight in his career. Lost a lot of fights that certain people overall thought that he should have not lost, or lost certain fights overall that, you possibly could have seen it going Zab's way if he just had the ability to adjust, more, if he just had the ability to do different things in there. But they just don't. And that's the thing I've always seen with Adrien Broner. I don't think he has the boxing IQ. I don't think that he has the complete skill set that many of his fan bases always alleged that he possibly had. That's just personally what I've always seen with Adrien Broner. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, that's really all I have to say on this matter. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know who you think would win this fight. And if you think that one of these guys would win the fight, or whichever one wins the fight, do you think they would win it dominantly? Because in my opinion, I think Regis Prograis wins dominantly, but I'm actually curious to see what the Adrien Broner fan base, or what a certain amount of people think about this fight, because I think that this fight would catch a certain amount of people's eye. So I am concerned with opinions, so we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.